So, we went over before in class what a motion tween is. You would basically have a series of frames with only one keyframe. You right click, you say create motion tween, and now if you go somewhere in the timeline and you move the item somewhere else, you get, your motion path. This motion path is editable like this, or using your sub selection tool. Whoops, there we go. Right, pulling on the anchor points, that kind of thing. You can always add a keyframe in somewhere else. If you click on the motion path itself in the timeline, you get an ease option. You get options for rotating across the entire timeline. Right, so we had already gone over that, but there is another kind of tweening, and depending on which exercise you're doing in your book, or depending on what thing you may need to do overall, you might use a different type. So the motion tween is the newer one. It's a lot more like, say, something in After Effects. But the classic tween is the old way of doing it. And the way of doing it is you have a keyframe at the beginning, and then you have a keyframe at the end. So I hit F6, get a new keyframe, and then I move this somewhere else. Right? So now this frame and all these frames look like this, and then the next frame looks like this. And now if I drag select all of this and I right click, I say create classic tween, you get this arrow, right? It's a different color, so you can tell it's different than this one. And you get the same motion, but you don't get the same tools. For example, there's no motion path, right? It's just, that's the motion. If I go to change it, I have to hit F6 to put in a new keyframe, and then I move this and I get two different sections, right? So now it goes down to here and then up to here. I can't select, whoops, this item unless it's on a keyframe. I can select this one anytime I want, but this has to be on a keyframe in order for me to select it. Alright, so if this seems like it's a little more restrictive, the answer is yes, it is. But why use it? Well, you need to know this one because a lot of people who sort of started early in this program, they still use it. That's their work method. Also, if you're animating any color effects or blend modes, sometimes it's nice to have different sections like this because you're not, there's no curve to it. Like the way this one is, you don't have motion curves in that. It just goes from point A to point B, goes from 0 to 60 opacity, those kinds of things. So having different segments you can work with is nice. Also, if I go outside the time, that part of the timeline, hit F6, add a new keyframe, I get an entirely separate section, and I can delete this. I can start from scratch. I'd probably say right click and remove tween. Oops. Right? I can start clean. You can't do that on this kind of motion tween. If I go outside here and I say F6, it continues the tween. I can't, let's see here. If I say remove tween, it gets rid of the whole thing. So some people like using the classic tween because you can kind of turn it off more easily. Now, in terms of the motion tween, and you are going to need to know this, there is a way to be able to sort of segment it away from, be able to continue on this layer with something new. And that's to, before you put any tweening in, before you even forget the animation and extra keyframes at the end, before you even do any right click motion tween, you go to the end and you say F6, make a new keyframe, right? And then you add the motion tween to this first part. But then at the end here, it's like a break. So, and I can still always add frames. I can sit in here and hit F5, add lots of frames, Shift F5 takes away frames. You have the same thing with the right click. You can insert frames or remove frames. It's all the same. You have all the same functionality, but you've got this break afterwards. And you can maybe continue with a different tween. Now, before I add in a new tween, I would, at the end of this, of course, right click, insert keyframe, and then I would tween this. And that's going to become very important as we get to the midterm when you guys set up your timelines for your characters, because you're going to need those breaks in between things. You're going to want things to be separate. Alright, so that's kind of the main difference between these tweens. This kind is very segmented, and this kind is very fluid, very connected, and much more editable. A lot more options. Um, Now, for the purpose of this class, I would stick to motion tween. Usually, unless there's a specific reason you need things to be separate. Like I said, if you're maybe sometimes animating the blend mode or a color effect. If your book says motion tween, it means motion tween. If it means classic tween, it will say the words classic tween. So make sure you use the right one, because sometimes the book goes over of something very specific that they want you to do, and it's only good on one and not the other, or vice versa. All right, so those are the basic tenets of the new tweening. The one thing I will say about both kinds is that there's always this rotate here in the properties. That is about how much it is rotating over the course of the entire tween. It is useful for, say, telling it to simply rotate 4 or 5 times over the course of a second, and you're going to see it's going to spin, right? It's going to spin multiple times. It is not, however, for, oh, it's steady, it's steady, it's steady, and then it starts spinning. Let me undo, there we go. So if you wanted something to change how much it rotated halfway through, you can add, insert a keyframe, say all, and, let's say it's still until here, and then maybe it'll rotate. I'm going to use the free transform tool a little bit. All right, so it's still, and then it rotates a bit. But once you try to rotate it more than 360 degrees, see how it goes backwards? It doesn't really understand what direction you want to go in, so it can get a little bit confusing. Sometimes you have to rotate it like half of the way and then rotate it more, or use this kind of tweening where it's still and then it's rotating, and then you can just simply tell it to rotate however many times. Or you can use this right here where you initially put in this keyframe, and it's really easy to copy and paste, frames from one thing to the other, so it'll start in the exact same place, and then you can use again this to tell it to rotate as many times as it needs to. Whoop, that would help if I actually, there we go. Yeah, so it kind of only rotates a little bit and then lots of rotating, and of course the direction is you choose here. So it just is a matter of, you do need to plan ahead. You need to know exactly what it's going to do, and then you can plan which tools to use.